Hello, I'm David Michelle Davies, CEO of the Webby Awards, coming to you from New York City. I want to say welcome, Happy New Year. We're so excited to have you back here today for one of our Overwrite events. As so many of you know, this year marks the 25th anniversary of the Webby Awards. It's a big year for us, and we are planning a celebration of the best of the internet in a year which I could best say is uncertain all around the world. We've also seen rapid change in so many different areas as industry turn to technology and digital solutions to help them respond to this crisis. At the Webby Awards, we've been really fascinated to watch the way the world adapts to changes going on using all of this technology. So we spent the last few months researching, documenting, studying the impact of the pandemic on society and the internet with our partners at Slack, YouGov, WP Engine. And we've created this series called Overwrite Tomorrow, which focuses on how the pandemic created an indispensable internet and ignited the urgency to build a better future. As part of that program, we conducted a YouGov survey with over 3,000 Americans all over the country, asking them about what they thought and how this pandemic had impacted them and how they'd use technology to help them remediate some of those effects. Very interesting results. 56% of people agree they've noticed flaws in society they wouldn't have noticed without daily life changing so drastically. 31% of people have noticed flaws in their personal lives they said they wouldn't have noticed without the pandemic. And maybe the best result or silver lining I've ever seen, a shockingly low 16% of respondents want the world to return to the way it was pre-pandemic. So only 84% of people want us to go back. We think that people are ready for a better future after this. And to that end, we're thrilled to end our 4-part Overwrite series with this conversation where we'll discuss the impact of the pandemic on how we live. We'll be talking to 2 phenomenal leaders in the space. I'm going to speak with Secretary Julián Castro, and then after what I'm sure will be an exciting conversation, our Executive Director, Claire Graves, have a chance to talk with Professor Scott Gallowat. Secretary Julián Castro hosts a podcast called Our America, which is from Lemonade Media that helps us reimagine an America where everyone can pursue their dreams. Each week, he speaks with world shapers and real life humans to help us understand where we are, how we got there, and how we can build a better future together. If you didn't know, Secretary Castro was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Barack Obama from 2014 to 2017. And he was also mayor of his native San Antonio, Texas. At that time, the youngest mayor of a top 50 American city. And in 2012, he gave the keynote speech at the Democratic National Convention, which I believe is the same keynote speech that Senator Barack Obama gave previously, which he described the American dream as a relay to be passed from generation to generation. In October 2008, Little Brown published Secretary Castro's memo, An Unlikely Journey, Waking Up for My American Dream. After his historic campaign for president in 2020, Secretary Castro launched People's First Future to help elect progressive candidates who campaign focused on improving American quality of life. Secretary Castro is living in San Antonio with his wife and 2 children. I'm so excited to welcome him. Secretary Castro, thank you. I'm going to start off and ask you about something that I think is probably pretty near to your heart, and that's San Antonio. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that San Antonio is a city in the America, like many, many others, tell me about how the pandemic has affected the lives of San Antonians.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I mean, you're right. I have a real love for San Antonio. It's the town I was born in, grew up in, obviously served as mayor in, and chose to come back to after my service in DC. Look, San Antonio is like a lot of other big cities. I mean, over the last few decades, it has really felt the effect of income inequality. It's a city that still largely is based in the hospitality industry, the service sector, for instance. And so that industry has been absolutely rocked by the pandemic. You have a lot of people that are still out of work. It's also a city with a very high Hispanic population and high rate of things like diabetes, obesity, a lot of those underlying conditions that make people particularly susceptible to the worst impact of COVID-19. So, you've seen a lot of economic damage and a lot of loss here. I think I saw over the last week that 176 people have passed away in Bexar County, which encompasses San Antonio and a number of suburbs. It's about 2.5 million people. And the number of COVID cases continues to rise. That's what we're dealing with right now in the community, a lot like many other communities in the United States.
So, I mean, you mentioned some of the makeup of the community in San Antonio, and sort of touched on, some of the health conditions that are somewhat prevalent, and that being some underlying conditions that make COVID more lethal. The other thing you talked about is that there's a high Hispanic population there, and we also know that BIPOC people in general have been more adversely affected by this disease than others.
That's true. No question, and all the research bears that out. We see that firsthand here. One of the things that's very clear is that so many people of color have been on the front lines as healthcare workers, as meat plant workers, as farm workers, in fast food restaurants that have stayed open and done takeout or drive-through. And my hope is that that once we're past this pandemic, in addition to what's being done now immediately for relief for families, hopefully that'll get done soon by the Biden administration and Congress, but that there are going to be some lasting changes that are made so that people no longer find themselves relegated to the bottom of the economic scale. And as you know, I mean, that is disproportionately Black and brown people in this country. In San Antonio, about 75% of the community are people of color, if you can believe that. I think it's the city with the highest percentage of people of color among big cities. It's a city now of 1.5 million people, just in the city by itself. Wow. Most people don't think of it that way. I think they think of it as a smaller community, but it is over 1.5 million people now, the seventh largest city. And so these changes that we need to make, I think, at the federal level, and a lot of them that the Biden administration has talked about, and some of them that it's rolled out just in the first week, they stand a chance of making a huge fundamental difference at the individual level, at the level of families, and at the level of a community like San Antonio.
I want to talk in a moment here about some of the positive effects that the internet has had through this pandemic. And it has been the glue in many ways. And I heard someone say to me that this has been very, very tragic, but it maybe hasn't been as tragic as the one that we had 100 years ago. And maybe that's because we've had this way of connecting in other ways via the internet. But I also want to acknowledge and discuss and ask about, it's also clear that there is a divide between those who are able to use the internet to continue working their normal job and sort of get through this in a less affected way, and those who weren't, and those who, as you said, were still doing jobs where like they couldn't work from home, and there is an inequity there as well. And I wanted to ask you about that.
No doubt. I mean, we see that. I was talking to somebody the other day who was in Silicon Valley and steeped in the civic life of Silicon Valley, and they remarked that for many people there on the upper middle to higher end of the scale, in some ways, the silver lining was that this experience made their life more convenient and gave them more opportunity to enjoy their time and their family and so forth. And many of us know that because they had the tools they needed to get their work done at their disposal. They could do it from home. They could do it safely. Of course, it did change things, but it didn't damage their ability to earn a living and so forth. And then there's everybody else that has to go into work if they're in the service sector or another job that requires it. And the thing is that we need to be able to address that inequality going forward, beginning with, I think, something as basic as making sure that the children of those workers have access to the internet so that they can learn effectively in this new world that we're in, where many kids are having to do remote learning. You may hear a stray sound or two coming from the background. I have 2 kids that are doing that right now as we speak. But this digital divide that still exists in our country is one perfect example, not only of how families presently encounter that inequality, but that it's baking that inequality into future generations, which is truly sad and unbecoming of a nation as innovative and as wealthy as we are.
And then I think the hope here is maybe we've exposed the inequality in a more severe way than would have otherwise been noticed. Maybe that's optimistic, but that would be sort of a hope. But just to put a finer point on it, I think that's, and I want you to talk about it, but I think that people think about this as like, oh, who doesn't have access to the internet? Everybody has a phone. But when you really get into these remote learning situations and you think about, you have two children, I have two children, we're not just talking about access to the internet, we're talking about access to more than one computer. And in some cases, if the adults are home working from home, now we could be talking about access to 2 or 3 devices and internet and I mean, it keeps going and going. These are real issues, and we don't, we have a lot of these city governments and state governments who are very hard pressed for funds to provide these devices because of the overall economic toll. I mean, this is like really serious, devastating stuff that, it's great that many people are able to survive and be fine, but it's not just that when people are vaccinated, we'll go back to normal. This is a real issue and will continue to be one for a long time.
I share your hope that the experience we're going through, even for those folks who are not experiencing those shortcomings, who are families of means, individuals of means, that American journalism is able to shine a spotlight on those inequalities, and that I think people do feel, we've had a lot of conversation the last couple of weeks about unity. Because of the new administration, I think rightfully making that a big theme of its first few days in office. But I do feel like we have an opportunity here, because I think that a lot of people are paying attention to the suffering of other folks more than they would, because they recognize that this is a time of a lot of suffering out there and loss. And the question for policymakers and for everybody is, how do you make the most of that greater shared understanding, or at least openness to understanding, than you might normally get. And so I think you have that right, that this has provided a worthwhile opportunity. And now we have to, you have to extend that beyond this moment. Once there's herd immunity, once the vaccine has taken hold, once we're off, a year from now, 2 years from now, doing other things. Because I think one of the biggest challenges for policymakers and for the American people these days is that the attention span is so short. I'm convinced that it's shorter than it ever has been. We can't lose that sense of understanding, of wanting to understand, and turning that into the political will to actually close that digital divide and make sure that these frontline workers have the healthcare that they need, and make sure that they're no longer making, just $8 an hour working at McDonald's or whatever, or at a grocery store, that we're actually paying people what they should be earning for a hard day's work. I will say, I'm encouraged by the first few days of the Biden administration, because I think that they are swinging bigger than we normally see at the beginning of administrations. I think that team has this sense that we're talking about, that, look, this is an opportunity to do good things, to do the right thing, and it's necessary right now and going forward.
So you mentioned there that there is, on some level, we hope at least, more of an understanding of the difficulties and struggles that other people are going through, or that everyone is going through. At least maybe there is today more than there was a year ago or 18 months ago. At the same time, we're more connected as a country, at the very least, than ever before. We're able to stay in closer touch, potentially not in person, but certainly via phone and internet and messaging than ever before. And we're able to sort of connect with leaders in ways more directly than ever before. It hasn't necessarily made the tone of the conversation or the results of the conversation, for lack of a better term, it doesn't, maybe these last week or two, but it certainly doesn't feel like I'm on. I'm on.
I think we got disconnected. Yeah.
There we go. As I was talking about how connected we are. Are we back live now? All right, apologies out there if we lost you. Hopefully we're back. Sorry about that, Secretary Castro.
No
You know where I was going. I was saying that, you know, on some level, all this additional connectivity has not necessarily led to more empathy. And I know it's easy to sort of chalk it up to the leadership of the past, but I would, having been on the internet for quite some time, I would say this is not something that just begun 4 years ago. It's something that had been brewing for a while. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll start that from the perspective of what we saw on January 6th at the Capitol. I think that was the symptom of something, and certainly as somebody that has been in public life, in public service, in politics now for 20 years, basically. I started as a city council member in 2001. I saw with the emergence of social media the ability in a good way for everybody to have their say, but also in a bad way. And the tendency with a lot of forums for input to go negative very quickly and, you know, to summon kind of the worst of human nature. And I think that that's what you've seen a lot of, especially during the Trump era, frankly, and that was fostered. My hope is that the January 6th events will catalyze, and to some extent they already have, these social media platforms to do a much better job of policing the worst of it. And also, I think you need leadership at every level, from the president on down, and not only in the public sector, but in the private sector, that is modeling civic behavior, that is trying to bring people together, that, as Joe Biden has said many times, is trying to, you know, cool the temperature down a little bit. That helps. And you know, all of us have our work cut out for us to try and do that.
I mean, one thing though that has been sort of become quite obvious, especially in light of recent events, the last couple of weeks here, is whichever platform you want to pick on or celebrate or whatever, that these social platforms are very, very powerful places where there is an incredible amount of exchange of ideas, and leaders from all over the world use them to communicate with people for good and bad in many cases. And I mean, you said it, you know, you said sort of these platforms we've really, I mean, I don't know if, you know, who used to have responsibility for the so-called civic square, but there is a lot of responsibility and or power from the companies who run these platforms. And does it make sense to have those companies sort of deciding which leaders could be on those platforms and not? And that's not at all a comment on wishing that the one who was taken off was still there, but just that it sort of brings light to the question in general.
Well, look, I mean, I agree with the concern that some have expressed about the power of these giant tech companies. And I think that there are different ways to go about that. Some people have suggested breaking some of them up. I think in the least that there needs to be a lot more competition among social media platforms, because you really don't have significant competition for Facebook or for Twitter. You know, you had Parler, and I think you have Gab and a few others, but they're not, you know, significant competitors right now. And I do believe that some of them are utilizing their platforms to leverage, you know, their other products and services, and that it's time for a Department of Justice that is more antitrust division that is more assertive about ensuring that there's good competition. And with regard to banning individuals and so forth, yeah, I do think that has to be used sparingly. But I also believe that the action that they took recently was justified, and actually that it was overdue, because you're dealing with a very special case there, of a very, very powerful, special role that that person played. And, there are not many instances where you're going to have that kind of dynamic.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about another sort of thing I think touches on sort of the tech industry in general, and that's the issue of immigration. And I want to broaden it out a bit though, and I do want to ask you about sort of the high skilled workers, but I also just want to ask you about all workers, whether they have doctorates or not. Um, I think that one of the wonderful things about Silicon Valley and technology is it has always embraced as a culture people from afar, and it's a very very admirable thing about the industry, and I think it breeds a ton of empathy, and it's really a wonderful part of the industry to work in, is that it generally wants and accepts and looks for outside ideas and from people from far away, and has been that way for years and years and years. um, I assume you're a supporter of bringing back those high skilled visas and allowing tech companies to get back to hiring people from abroad.
Yeah, I think that we need to harness the best talent from around the world. And that's what's helped build Silicon Valley into the powerhouse that it is. It's helped lead American innovation, and continues to do that today. I think we took a step backward under the last administration, and we need to get back at least to where we were, and that we can do two things at the same time, right? We can improve American education and opportunities for folks who are growing up and coming up through our school system, to land those jobs and to create those companies and innovate in the same way. And also, we can welcome people from around the world. I like it that America is able to take some of the best talent from other places and make it our own, and lead in medicine and in all parts of tech. So I'm pleased that the new administration has a different outlook when it comes to H-1B visas and other things.
Yeah, but talk to me. Let's talk a little bit about though people who aren't on H-1Bs, because I've always saw and felt in this country that the strength of this country is not that it was only letting people who so-called had merit, but it was accepting of people who could get here, and that in itself was merit. And this previous administration had refocused this on this idea that only the very very top people can come here. But is that how you see it as well, or do you think that we should be more accepting of people, whether regardless of degree or status?
This country was built up by many people from around the world over the generations, of different skin colors, obviously different nationalities, that came here poor and oftentimes without much of a formal education. I mean, you can talk to folks whose ancestors were from Germany or Italy or Poland or China or Mexico, like my grandmother, who came here with hardly anything. And my grandmother came when she was a 6 or 7-year-old orphan. And by any standard, I mean, she didn't live out the American dream. She worked as a maid, a cook, and a babysitter. But number one, there's honor in that work, right? There's integrity in a hard day's work, and she lived to see my brother and me get into Stanford and get into Harvard Law School, and then one of us served President Obama in his cabinet, and my brother still serves in the United States Congress, and that's how our families from all around the world, those are the dreams that we've lived in America. And I believe that we can continue on that path, and we should, versus saying we're only going to take people who have already made it, at least in terms of their education. I think that's a mistake for the long term.
And your podcast, Building a Better America, I think taps into some of these stories. I think it taps into stories of working class people throughout the United States and their struggles. Tell me about it and why you decided to launch it.
Yeah, over the last 6 years or so, I had the chance to travel, I think, to 47 different states and over 100 different communities, big and small. And Our America, my podcast, really is about how the American experience differs from one family to the next. I wanted to take a lens to people's different experiences in this country, and especially a lot of stories that aren't often told. And so we've done episodes, for instance, on people who live in a mobile home community outside of Des Moines, Iowa, and Waukee, who fought back when a private equity group bought out their trailer park. And we did an episode about people who live in storm drainage tunnels of Las Vegas because they're homeless. We've even shown a light on the foster care system, which is something that millions of kids have gone through, oftentimes, unfortunately, to worse results than they may have had, more likely to drop out, more likely to be incarcerated and so forth. But we don't spend a lot of time talking about it or trying to improve it. So that's the idea behind Our America, is to tell these stories, in very real ways, compelling ways. And hopefully, I hope, just like, this is not classic journalism, but journalism, I think at its best, it makes a difference by shining a spotlight, and perhaps people that can make a difference, who are policymakers and others, will make a difference.
You actually practice this concept of like reimagining on your podcast, which I think is very powerful. If you were to sort of reimagine the United States, what is the ideal version you would like to reimagine or create?
Well, I think the ideal version of our country is one that lives up to the ideas of its founding document, where people are treated equally, where everybody has a fair shot at opportunity, where we're able to have an America that works for everybody, no matter who you are, no matter your background. And our founders recognize this, and our leaders of today recognize that this is still a work in progress. And my hope is that with our podcast, Our America, that we're shining a spotlight on each piece of it and thinking through, okay, how can we reimagine it? How would it be better? How can we make it better?
It's a good practice for all of us to do probably more frequently than you do. Secretary Castro, thank you so much for joining us. It's been such an honor. The podcast is Building a Better America. I want to encourage all of our audience to check it out if you haven't already. And most of all, thank you for your service.
Thank you. Take care.
In a moment, I'm going to hand it over to our Executive Director, Claire Graves, who's going to talk to Professor Scott Gallowat. Before I pass the microphone over, I do want to thank again Secretary Castro, such an inspiration and dedicating his life to such important parts, I think, of our country and of the way that it can be better. And that's really what this Overwrite series has been all about. So thank you to him. I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone that our extended deadline is coming up. If you're making work that you're proud of, and I hope you are, I know it's been a hard year to make work that you're proud of, but many of you are, you're ready to enter the Webby Awards. And the deadline, our extended deadline is February 12th. We encourage everyone to get their work in, since this is your last chance to do so of the year. We have a lot of new categories for virtual and remote work that we've all been working on, creating those type of experiences. So check it out. It's at webbyawards.com. On that note, it is a great pleasure that I pass it over to my colleague, Executive Director of the Webby Awards, Claire Graves.
Thank you, David Michelle. I am extremely excited to introduce our next guest, Professor Scott Gallowat. Scott Gallowat is a professor of marketing at NYU Stern School of Business and a serial entrepreneur. He has founded 9 companies, including Profit, Red Envelope, L2, and Section 4. He is the New York Times bestselling author of The Four, The Algebra of Happiness, and most recently, Post-Corona, From Crisis to Opportunity, which we're going to talk about today. His Prof G and Pivot podcast, No Mercy, No Malice blog, and Prof G YouTube channel reach millions. Pivot is an award-winning podcast and has won numerous awards over 2020 and recently, I think, as well. However, I would say the most important and prestigious honor it has received is both the Webby and Webby People's Voice Award for Best Business Podcast at last year's 24th Annual Webbies. We're huge fans of Pivot and Scott Galloway at the Webbies. There is rarely a week that goes by where the show is not mentioned in group discussions, and his thoughts and ideas often help inform our business and what we do. So I'm so excited to welcome you, Scott. Last 6 months researching and focused on the pandemic and its impact on the internet industry and the work brands and companies are making. And we kind of had the takeaway that this is the time that everyone has to take stock and consider what they're doing and use this moment to think about how they can contribute to a better world through their work. So when I read your book, Post-Corona from Crisis to Opportunity, I thought, we have to talk to Scott because there's so much alignment in what you are focused on and what we're focused on. And the book looks beyond what we're experiencing right now and predicts what could happen if we make change, looking at what can be different about business, education, this country, with a strong focus on the pandemic and how it will reshape the business environment. So I thought we could start there with you telling us a little bit more about the book and the thesis that you have with the books, your thoughts on how the pandemic will impact society.
Sure. So I think that the enduring impact of the novel coronavirus will be that it's more of an accelerant than a change agent. E-commerce is a great metaphor. Loosely speaking, e-commerce as a percentage of retail started to gain traction in 2000. And every year has grown 1 percentage point. And most recently was sitting at 18 points of all retail was done through digital channels in March of 2020. And then within 8 weeks, it jumped to 28%. So we had a decade of acceleration in about 8 weeks. Online grocery accelerated 6 years, work from home accelerated 20 years, our government spending accelerated 24 years. I think a decent exercise in any business is to essentially take the 3 most dominant trends in your industry, look at the slope of that trend, and then extend it out 10 years and ask yourself, are you there now? So there's been incredible acceleration, and there's some very exciting things. The other term I would use is dispersion, and that is we're dispersing value beyond traditional points of distribution. An easy example is Wonder Woman 1984 used to have to go to a theater. Now it's in your living room. Retail's been dispersed from shelves and stores to warehouses and your smartphone. Healthcare might be dispersed from hospitals and doctors' offices to your smartphone. If you think about it, 99% of the people who've contracted, endured, and developed antibodies for the novel coronavirus likely won't have entered a doctor's office, much less a hospital. So there's enormous, what you would call dispersal. Dispersal HQ, $12 trillion in commercial real estate, huge declines in, might we be taking our work and dispersing it to our homes, which will have huge impact on asset classes of transfer of wealth from commercial real estate, a $12 trillion industry in the United States, to residential real estate. And as a result, we're seeing record highs in residential real estate, lumber costs, et cetera, restoration stock, hardware stock, Sona stock skyrocketing. So there's some very exciting things around the reshuffling of the economy, but also dispersion's kind of second cousin to segregation. And that is if we're no longer commuting, we don't see the homeless veteran. If we're not in malls, we don't see people from different income or ethnic groups. If we're not in public schools, we don't see kids who smell, look, or feel differently than us. We don't see the single mother, if we're not dining out as much, bringing us our food. So there's a lot of studies showing that when you don't mix with different economic classes or different ethnic groups, once those economic classes and ethnic groups increase, you resent them. So it leads to further polarization in our society. We've also seen the economy evolve from being a dysfunctional economy to a dystopian overnight. If you make more than $100,000 a year, and I'll stop after this. If you make over $100,000 a year, you've seen no interruption in employment. There's been no change in unemployment, and 60% can work from home. If you make less than $40,000 a year, 40% of those people have incurred some sort of interruption in employment, and less than 10% can work from home. So kind of the dirty secret of this pandemic, we don't like to say this out loud, is that if you're in the top 10% and you're blessed with good health, you're living your best life. The pandemic has meant more time with Netflix, your children, and your stock market holdings have exploded. And I worry that that has dampened what should have been a full-throated capitalist response to this crisis. That when World War II broke out, within 9 days of Pearl Harbor, Chrysler converted its largest factory in Michigan to a factory punching out M1 Bradley tanks. And that factory produced more tanks than the entire Third Reich. And I would wonder if Amazon stock had been cut in half versus accelerating 70% since the pandemic began, if the person delivering my Nespresso pods tomorrow morning would also get out of the van and stick a needle in my arm. So there's some incredibly positive opportunities here. There's some incredibly negative ones. And, but the basis of the book is, you could have called the book The Great Acceleration or The Great Dispersion. I think it's literally reshuffling our economy.
One of the areas that you really focus on in the book, and one of the areas that, as you just said, is booming during the economy is, of course, big tech. So I wanted to go there next. It's been a huge month for big tech. I mean, it feels like it's a huge month every month for big tech at the moment, but notably this month, in the wake of the insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th, big tech has been under fire for enabling the organization of the groups that stormed the Capitol. Donald Trump has been removed from Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Apple, Google, and Amazon removed Parler from their platforms. It looks like tech is starting to take meaningful action. David Michel and Secretary Castro spoke about this a little bit, but I wanted to ask you about it as well. You've said big tech is now our new government. What exactly do you mean by that, and how did we get here?
Well, we have an insurrection in our elected representatives who, every representative of the House represents 755,000 Americans. So when they're on their hiding in the rafters and barricading the doors with furniture and terrified for their lives, we're all terrified. I mean, that's us. And so, I believe that there is no unity unless there's accountability. And not only Professor Berkeley has this great book on stupidity, and he defines stupid as people who, he has two axes: benefit to society, benefit to yourself. And there are people who benefit society but can't figure out a way to benefit themselves. He calls them the helpless. I think of them as artists. Then he has people who benefit themselves but don't benefit society. They're called the bandits. There's the intelligent people who figure out a way to benefit themselves and benefit others. That's the basis of capitalism. And then there's the people who damage society and have no benefit to themselves. They're called the stupid. And I would argue that the mob was largely made up of people who are stupid. Most of them will end up in jail or fired from their companies, and I'm not sure they accomplished anything except damaging our society and setting our country's national standing back decades. And then there are the bandits, and I would argue that big tech falls in that category, and that is they figured out a way to amplify rage such that if they promote anti-vax content or misinformation about the election beyond the natural oxygen it would get on its own, that creates enragement, which creates engagement, which creates more Nissan ads, which increases shareholder value. So they have effectively figured out a way to program these in different algorithms that determine that if they can enrage people, they can engage them, and there's a profit incentive. And I think that I'm confident that the majority of the mob will be held accountable. I'm less confident that the folks at big tech will be held accountable. But I think that you deserve no credit when 1,449 days into the president's 1,460-day tenure, you decide all of a sudden to suspend his account. And then within 72 hours, 3/4 of misinformation on the election disappears. We fell into this lie that, it'd be so impossible to moderate these platforms. That's bullshit. There's about 30 platforms responsible for probably 2/3 of the really damaging content. An 8th grader with a laptop could figure this out, but these companies have slow rolled anything resembling that might be good for the Commonwealth because it's good for shareholder value. So look, I think that the algebra of disincentive is not in play here. And simply put, until there is real penalties for a coup, it's going to happen again. And I think there needs to be real penalties across the people at big tech that knew that this misinformation was spreading on their platform. They knew their platforms were being used to organize this mob, and they enabled it. And I'm not saying they wanted an insurrection. A drunk driver supposedly on average is driven drunk 200 times before they get a DUI or kill somebody. So I don't think that big tech wanted to kill that family in the minivan, but they've been driving drunk. And I think they bear some culpability here. And back to the algebra of disincentive. If someone calls you, Claire, and says, I can get your son or daughter into UCLA if you just give me $50,000 to give to a tennis coach, you're going to hang up the phone because you saw Aunt Becky do a perp walk. And you've decided that that is not a risk worth taking. Until someone does a perp walk at big tech, expect them to slow roll, delay and obfuscate any real meaningful change. And in terms of them being our new government, when we have an insurrection, do we turn to the FBI? Do we turn to our elected leaders? No, we turn to Airbnb to stop letting them book apartments in Washington. We ask Amazon to not support Parler. I mean, if this is the position in, we're begging 30 and 40-something-year-old tech executives to save our country. And so I think it's safe to say, all right, well, how did we get here? How did we get to a point where we're hoping that they call on their better angels and then we're applauding them for canceling his account? They knew what was going on here. Anyways, I'm on my soapbox. I'll stop there.
So what do you think the solution is then? If it's not financial incentives, how do we get them to change these business models?
Well, I mean, it depends who you're talking about. Facebook and Google have great businesses trafficking and misinformation and rage. And people say, well, it's a First Amendment issue and don't censor me. And the big tech companies love that argument. It's a ridiculous argument. The First Amendment is that Congress should pass no law inhibiting free speech. These companies aren't subject to that. They're private companies. I used to go on CNBC every Wednesday for 5 years. And then I started talking about big tech being a nemesis. And one Wednesday they said, we don't want you back. Were they censoring me? That's their right. They're a private company. They can censor me, whatever they want. They have that right and they have that obligation to reduce inflammatory incendiary content. And they've ignored that obligation. So they've slow rolled this notion of First Amendment. So a couple things. One, I think they need to be broken up. I think they've become way too powerful. We have a proud legacy of antitrust in this country that we've ignored with big tech. There are now more lobbyists from Amazon, full-time lobbyists in DC working for Amazon than there are sitting US senators. There are more PR and spin executives manicuring Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg's image working for Facebook than there are journalists in the New York Times. So the ratio of bullshit and spin to journalists has gone 6x in the wrong direction. The number of journalists in America has been cut in half the last 30 years. The number of PR and comms people has tripled. So Washington is literally overrun. So I think we need antitrust. I think we need regulation. It is ridiculous these companies aren't held to the same standards as every other company. And like I said, I just, at the end of the day, I think someone needs an orange jumpsuit here because when you find Facebook $5 billion and their market cap's $500 billion, if I showed up to your house, Claire, and I said, I'll indemnify you against anything wrong you've done to date for 1% of your net worth, you'd say, where do I sign? So our regulatory bodies have become co-conspirators instead of countervailing forces. And I think that we need to switch the tables here and ensure that these companies feel a vested interest, and not only the upside, but the downside. And we need to send a strong signal that trafficking in a business model that results in a Capitol Police officer being bludgeoned by a fire extinguisher is not a good way to make a living.
I could talk to you about this for hours, but we only have a certain amount of time. And what I really loved about your book was the opportunities, the insights and opportunities that you see coming from the pandemic. And one of the areas that I also find very fascinating is your focus on higher education. I grew up around universities. My father was in higher education. He ran universities in the United Kingdom, and I grew up running around the halls of Adelaide University in South Australia. And so I find your take on how the pandemic has changed higher education and will change higher education in the future really fascinating. So I was hoping that you could talk about that and the impact it will have on society.
Well, there's silver linings here that are as big as the cloud. And that is, we might be dispersing education away from this artificial supply constraint of university campuses. And that is, if we take 50% of our classes online, we overnight theoretically double the capacity. But it could go one of two ways. My course on Tuesday nights is 160 kids, each paying $7,000. When it went online this fall, because of COVID-19, they expanded enrollment to 280. They each pay $7,000. So that's $2.1 million for young people to listen to me do this for 12 nights. And I'm not humble. I think I'm good at what I do. Some nights I'm even great, but charging kids $160,000, mostly incurred in debt, is morally corrupt. So I'd like to think that at some point, your ability to expand supply through big and small tech, whether it's Zoom or Teams or Slack, will put cost pressure on these universities or create an opportunity to expand their enrollments. And for me, this is, a bit of a personal crusade. I was on this morning with 55 chancellor presidents, most of whom found my comments repugnant. But I believe that effectively, after serving on the board of a university, being a faculty member for 17 years at a university, that pretty much every decision university leadership administrators make is with one objective, and that's to reduce their accountability and increase their compensation. Tuition skyrocketed 1,400% in the last 30 years. Administrative costs have skyrocketed, but outcomes haven't increased. They aren't educating more people, and the return on investment, meaning the salary they get relative to their investment, hasn't increased. So you have compensation skyrocketing and you have tuition skyrocketing. And so my sense is we've decided we're no longer public servants, but we're luxury brands. And we brag that we turn away 90% of our applicants, which is tantamount to a housing shelter bragging they turned away 90% of the people who showed up last night. I think we've lost the script. We no longer see ourselves as public servants, but as luxury brands. So I'm hopeful that big tech gives us the ability to take admissions rates back to where they were when I applied. When I applied to UCLA, there was a 60% admissions rate. Now it's 12%. It's literally 5 times as hard to get into UCLA as it was when I applied. And our national higher ed kind of reflects our national character, or a change in our national character, where America used to be about trying to figure out a way to get people in the bottom 90%. How do we get them in the top 10%? And now it feels like in America, our goal is to take the top percent and make them billionaires. And so higher ed kind of reflects that, and that the people who get into the greatest wealth creator in history are platform, and that is elite universities in the US. We have a caste system in the US. We like to think we're a meritocracy. Now we're a caste system. And it's largely based on the wealth of your parents or the institution you graduate from. And the people who have access to the highest caste are primarily 2 cohorts: the children of wealthy people, or freakishly remarkable middle and lower income people that we smear over the lens of this cancer such that we can feel better about ourselves. So I hope that we regain, or higher ed retakes its place as the upward lubricant in our society, as opposed to the caste system enforcer. And I think technology plays a big role in that, and hopefully expanding enrollments dramatically, increasing admittance rates, and decreasing costs, which have become totally out of control. I hear a lot of people brag, I would never get into the university I went to if I had to apply now. Well, guess what? That means your daughter's not getting in. So I think we need to absolutely flip the script and the approach to higher education and fall back in love with the unremarkables, as opposed just to trying to accept remarkables.
Another huge impact of the pandemic on society is the impact that it will have on, or it is already having, on work and community. As part of our research, we did a study with YouGov. We surveyed 3,000 Americans, and 75% of our respondents said that they want at least some things about society to permanently change. One of the obvious changes is at the moment is movement around the country, movement from big cities to smaller cities. People have been leaving big cities like New York and San Francisco to smaller towns and cities. There's a lot of talk of Silicon Valley moving to Miami or Austin. What do you think the impact of this movement will be on big cities like New York?
I think the rumor of death of cities has been greatly exaggerated. At the end of the day, I think density creates culture, creativity, and economic value. And we're still going to find that despite the pandemic, which creates obviously a slowdown in big cities, I think that the vast majority of economic value is still going to be created in the world's biggest cities. And that now it's situational. San Francisco has become, if San Francisco is a product, that product has just become expensive but bad. It's just gotten it's so poorly run. It's so expensive and so bad that people will leave for a better city that offers better value proposition. Miami offers a better value proposition right now. So you're going to see some shifting. You have a migration out of California, New York. Basically, the migration patterns in the United States are very simple. It's sunshine and low taxes. So high tax, cold states people are leaving, and low tax, high sunshine states, they're flocking to. But they're not flocking to Lubbock, Texas. They're flocking to Austin. They're not flocking to Ocala, Florida. They're flocking to Miami. So you'll see some horse trading, or you'll see some big cities go down and some big cities come up. But cities are still, my advice to young people is get in your processing power, get in your software, get credentialed in the form of some sort of degree or some sort of special training, and get to a city. So I'm actually relatively bullish on cities. They've taken a hit, but I think all those people who, the majority of people who were able to move outside the city to their sort of pandemic go bag city house are already rich. So the people who want to get rich are still going to find the city is the place to do that. And Amazon, Facebook, and Google are all doubling down in New York and actually leasing more space. Because if you're a 25-year-old double E from MIT, where does she want to live? And you say to her, do you want to live in London or New York or Sydney for a couple of years? And we'll create a Xanadu lifestyle for you where you make professional progress, maybe meet a spouse, an apartment, live this storybook lifestyle. There just aren't that many really talented 24-year-olds who think, no, I don't want to do that. And they're the secret sauce in any company, is young people who don't have dogs and spouses yet and can work all the time and add 80% of the value of the very expensive 40-year-old for 30% of the price. If that sounds ageist, it is. So anyways, I'm very bullish on cities. The most talented young people in the world want to be in cities.
So hoping that it will bring vibrancy to those cities and opportunity and more interesting culture.
Yeah.
Our survey also revealed that only 19% of people want work to go back to the way that it was before the pandemic. And actually, anecdotally, from talking to a lot of companies over the last 6 months, we've seen that people are hoping for a hybrid version of remote working and office life. What do you think the impact of this will be on business?
So I think that the operative word in there is hybrid. My first job was at Morgan Stanley right out of UCLA at 1251 Avenue of the Americas in Midtown. And they track how many people are in the building for security purposes. And it was averaging 8,500 people during work hours pre-pandemic, and now it's 500. And that will increase with the vaccinations, but I don't think it's going back to 8,500. And the majority of companies are not going to be all remote. The majority of companies are not going to demand that you're 100% in person. And the tolerance, acceptance, consumer behavior, worker behavior has led to, okay, maybe you don't work from home, but you're much more inclined to work from home on a Thursday or Friday if that's the only time you can see your kids, or you want to reduce your commute by 4 hours a week by not going in. And by the way, your peers and your superiors are now kind of comfortable with that. So it's just hard to imagine we're not going to see a 20 or 30% decline in demand for commercial office space. There are some negative externalities there in terms of be careful what you wish for. People will feel more freedom to move further from home, which will create a need, or further from headquarters, which will create and also decide that someone should stay home with the kids. That's usually the woman. And let's call it what it is. The woman carries a disproportionate amount of the responsibility for childcare. To a certain extent, remote learning K through 12 has dispersed responsibility for educating children from teachers to mothers. And so a lot of moms are feeling pressure to either work remotely or give up their job. And when you work remotely, you're not as likely to maintain the same trajectory professionally. Why? There's studies showing your proximity to headquarters is directly correlated to your professional trajectory, because when there's 3 people who are eligible to get promoted to VP, the SVP promotes the person they have a relationship with. And relationships are a function of proximity. So it is an advantage to be able to put on a suit or a dress and come into work and have physical contact and establish relationships with people. And so while we're going to see increased flexibility that a lot of women will take advantage of, it will result, in my opinion, likely rebroadening of the wage gap. Also, I think it'll put pressure on wages for non-senior level employees, because if your job can be moved to Denver, it can be moved to Delhi. So I think it's going to be interesting. I think there's going to be some unintended consequences of what everyone thinks is this great flexible work from home movement. And also there is a serendipity and a creativity you lose without the electricity of being in person. So it's going to be fascinating for academics 5-7 years on to see what's happened when 30-50% of office hours decline, like what impact it has on the genders, wage inequality, and what happens to people when they go totally remote versus the people who go through the pain of showing up to actual HQ every day. I think there's an advantage there.
I agree with you. And one of the interesting things that we've seen is, you talk about creativity, the creative industries, so the brands and the advertising agencies that we've been talking to, the percentage of people that actually want to return to the way it was before return to the office is much, much higher than, the average 20% that want it to stay in a high or don't want it to return to the way that it was. We're running out of time, so I thought I would just jump into some questions from the audience. One question from Damon from Miami. What aspect of the way we utilize tech during the pandemic do you see extending to when we go back to normal? Which trends should we not say goodbye to?
Obviously, there's just been an explosion in collaborative working, whether it's Teams or Slack or Zoom. I think we're probably delivery of food. I think we're going to see a permanent, delivery, whatever you want to call it. What other tech? I don't know. I think we're all becoming addicted to scripted television. I think that's a really interesting question. What technologies? There's been such a massive increase, but it's not really new technologies. There's just been dramatic increases. So I don't have a really thoughtful answer other than collaborative tools have skyrocketed. I think it's just taken every existing technology trend and massively increased it. So I apologize. I don't have a more thoughtful, compelling answer.
Well, the entertainment industry, definitely. Broadcast, Netflix,
Yeah.
HBO, Warner, all of those.
Yep. No doubt.
Definitely. All right, I don't want to take up all your time, so we just have one final question that we've been asking everyone. What have you learned, implemented, or embraced over the last year that will become part of your company moving forward?
Well, if it's okay, I'll answer it a different way. And that is, what is the one thing I'm trying to take out of this personally? And I think of it as being the profound opportunity coming out of this pandemic. And that is, I wrote a book on happiness. So I think a lot about happiness as a skill set. I don't think it's something you can assume it comes naturally to people. I think you have to work at being better at being happy. And it's something I'm not very good at. Wrote a book on it. And all the research points to just one thing. And that is, it's really a function of the number of deep and meaningful relationships you have. And what I'm encouraging people to do, and I talk to my students a lot about, is to ask yourself 3 questions in this pandemic. And the first is, is this a moment or an opportunity to become a caretaker for somebody? If you're blessed with good health, economic security, and you're an organized, shit together person, can you leverage some of those assets in a crisis to take care of someone in your life who's older than you and needs help, whether it's an uncle, whether it's your dad? But is this a moment to pivot to being a caregiver for somebody? Two, ask yourself if you have the relationship with your siblings that you want. If you were forced to say goodbye to them over FaceTime because one of them was stricken with COVID, is your relationship where you want it to be? And then finally, do you have the relationships with your friends that you want? Have you made the requisite investments? Have you let perceived slights or competitiveness or other bullshit get in the way of your friendships? This is a crisis, and a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. But one of the wonderful things about a crisis is you can accomplish in weeks what otherwise might take years. So if you can extend generosity, empathy, a certain amount of love, you can accomplish in weeks what otherwise might take years. And that's the cementing and the repair of key relationships. So that's something I'm focused on. It's something that does not come easy to me, but I think that is the profound opportunity coming out of this crisis.
Perfect answer. Connection is one of the most interesting things that has come out of the crisis for me. Scott Galloway, I want to say thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Post-corona, From Crisis to Opportunity, I encourage everybody to read it. I really enjoyed it. I got a lot out of it. And thanks again.
Thank you.
We have a few copies of Professor Galloway's books to give our audience on Instagram. So if you head over to the Webby Awards, you can get your hands on a copy. There's rules on the first post on our feed, so take a look. And again, I encourage everybody to read the book. Before I wrap up, another quick reminder, our extended entry deadline is coming up Friday, February 12th. You can enter at webbyawards.com. I want to say a huge thank you to our guests, Secretary Julián Castro and Professor Scott Galloway. Thanks to David Michel. And finally, we also want to say a huge thank you to our sponsors, Slack, YouGov, and WP Engine for their support for this program. And thank you all for joining us today. Thanks and stay well.